Our first panel of the day takes a deep dive into what researchers would like to see from the FDA in terms of regulatory and policy changes. Mark Skinner is president and CEO of the Institute for Policy Advancement, a global health strategies consulting company. He's also an assistant professor at McMaster University. It's great to have him with us. And Dr. Wen-Hann Tan is an attending physician in the Division of Genetics and Genomics at Boston Children's Hospital and an associate professor of pediatrics at Harvard Medical School. Welcome to you both. Dr. Tan, let me start with you. My understanding is you're one of the rare people who have dived deeply into the rare disease space and have kind of approached the rare disease arena, many parts of it. And when my team talked to you about what you had heard from patients, what you've been informed from your experience about tweaks in the way we do research and respond and do therapies, they came out with something I think would make a great book. I mean, you have a lot of critiques of the system, and would love to give our audience an understanding of the parts of this process that you think we could really begin to remedy in different ways.
Thank you, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk to you about this really important topic today. So I think what we really need in the rare disease world is legislation that would really compel the FDA to engage actively with patient support groups, as well as the key opinion leaders in the field in their drug approval process. So it's very heartening to hear from Dr. Woodcock that she would like patients to be more involved. Our experience, certainly in the Angelman syndrome world that I've been involved in, is that very often what happens is that drug companies would go to the FDA, present a proposal for a clinical trial as part of their pre-IND meeting, and then they are told by the FDA to perform certain procedures or to design their trial in a certain way that perhaps they may not have thought of doing or may not have wanted to do, but felt compelled to do so because the FDA told them to do that. And when they come back to see us, we say, well, that really doesn't work for this disorder, for this community. I think what would be really helpful is for the rare disease community, both patients and clinicians who manage and treat these patients, to be involved in the discussion with the FDA and the drug company upfront, so that when they come up with suggestions for changes to their protocol, modifications of protocol, they can have input from the rare disease community. The other thing that Dr. Woodcock had brought up is the use of natural history data. And that is a really important point. And unfortunately, the FDA seems to have been very reluctant to actually use data from natural history studies conducted by academic investigators as part of the drug approval process. So we have been running a natural history study in Angelman syndrome since 2006. So this coming up to 16 years now. And we are hearing from some drug companies that the FDA is skeptical of our data, even though our study was initially funded by the NIH and currently actually funded by the FDA itself. And yet people are telling us that, well, companies have to conduct their own natural history studies because they don't trust or can't use the data that we have generated in a highly rigorous study. So I think that I think what Dr. Woodcock has sort of said in her interview is great, except that there seems to be a disconnect between what she's espousing and what is actually happening at the level of the review divisions.
That is, a fascinating comment. And when I heard Dr. Woodcock make the comment, I wondered to what degree, the staff and teams of the FDA reflected that. Mark Skinner, I know that you've been very outspoken as well on how you see the relationship between research and, I think you've got this great line, of how do we move patient anecdotes to evidence? Would love to get, your take on how, again, I try to put it to Dr. Woodcock. I know there's lots of pressure to get to clinical endpoints and get the process moved along. And you wonder where that balance with public safety and therapeutic responses is, and would love to get your thoughts on it. And we can come back to Dr. Tan.
Yes, and thank you. Thank you for having me on today. So, just one brief addition to my introduction. I am an individual. I live with severe hemophilia. I come from the rare disease world and have a lifetime of experience working both nationally and globally in the hemophilia and blood disorders space. So, so my comments come from a perspective of experience as well as aspiration. Uh, the safest, most effective drugs that aren't available to patients are of no use to us. So what are the missing links that will help us bring drugs to market? Too often we have found that the clinical development, the drug development pipeline is siloed, that companies think about what's required to get the FDA or the EMA approval, and then they think about what's required to either pass a technology assessment or to get market access. And then even the third bucket, what information is needed for patients and clinicians to make a decision. And so patients really need to be at the table throughout that whole process. I guess my aspiration is for the FDA to perhaps take a little bit heavier hand in making sure that the companies, when they're in their early development work, truly have sat down and engaged with patients and understand what would make a difference in your life. What are really the outcomes that we're looking for? And that the clinical trials will be designed around those and collect the data. Too often we look at some of the narrow elements of bringing a drug to market, but it doesn't really answer the question that's important. And if that data is not available, then it's going to be very difficult to persuade payers to pay for that data and for patients to understand it. So while it's great to be supportive of natural history studies and to talk the talk, the concepts of patient-focused drug development have been around for a while, but it's somewhat of a chicken and egg. The companies don't collect it, they don't report it, and it's not out in a timely way. So unless we are rewarding and acknowledging and really pursuing the companies making those decisions and those engagements early on, we're not going to be able to move forward. And as I've reflected, I really think the FDA is the linchpin here that can really drive this forward.
So, Mark, before I jump back to Dr. Tan, I just want to understand, are you saying that right now, say we have an X rare disease, a relatively small community in the United States, I want to remind everybody, rare diseases are 1 in 10 Americans in this country, so it is much more prevalent than is often discussed. But in the process of this, you want the FDA to meet with those researchers, meet with patients to begin, laying out a track for what they would hope to generate, as opposed to more hands-off. Am I getting that right, Mark? And I apologize, I'm a layperson in this, so if I'm saying it badly, I apologize.
Well, and I'm a layperson too. My expertise comes from a lifetime of lived experience, and I'm trained as a lawyer, not as a clinician or a researcher. But I want the FDA to hold the companies accountable when they come in with their primary, their secondary, their exploratory endpoints for their trials to say, how did you come up with these? Were patients involved? Or these are outcomes that would make a difference in the life of a patient? And to be able to demonstrate that early on. And I think if the FDA is asking those questions consistently and holding the companies accountable to be able to demonstrate that, in fact, the drug they're developing is designed around patient centricity, I think we'll come a long way in moving forward, and that will help us downstream when we work on market access and patient-clinician shared decision-making in the clinical setting.
Dr. Tan, I'd love to get any of your reactions to what Mark Skinner is suggesting by way of an early step in the process, and thoughts on natural history data that's generated. But I want to ask you something else, because we've just come through, I actually hate those words. We are not yet through COVID, but we're experiencing COVID. And as I've done various events in the health space, it's just very clear to me that COVID has disrupted research, has disrupted clinical trials. I've heard with Francis Collins recently talking about, he estimates a $10 billion hit to research programs, the collapse of clinical sites to actually go get data. And so there's been some credit given to the FDA that in some places they've allowed telehealth and other forms of data collection. But I'm just wondering, as you comment on Mark's comments, but can you share with us how far have we been set back because of COVID in the rare disease research space?
Thank you. So these are really important questions. So first of all, I will say I totally echo what Mark has just said. I think everything that he has said, I would fully support. I will also say that we want to engage with the FDA. I see the FDA as our friend, not as an adversary. I want to work with the FDA to make this program and this process much smoother, much better for our patients, right? So we need the FDA on our side, and we need to engage with the FDA. Now, coming to your point about COVID for a minute. So yes, COVID has been very disruptive for clinical drug development, for clinical trials. I've personally been involved in 2 clinical trials throughout this COVID era. And what I think we have learned is that while on one hand, it has been disruptive in that we had not been able to bring patients in person for visits, it has actually forced us to use technology that we had not previously thought about. So for example, remote visits. So as an example, in pre-COVID, we used to have study visits that were several hours long, which actually were quite burdensome for patients. But because of COVID, we were able to pivot and were forced indeed to pivot into a mixture of in-person and telemedicine visits. And what that has done is to greatly reduce the burden on patient participation. And it actually has made trials, in some ways, almost paradoxically, more accessible to patients because they no longer have to travel to individual sites and spend many, many hours. We can do this remotely. So I think COVID has both been a curse and a blessing in some ways. Certainly more a curse than a blessing for many of us who were affected by it personally. But it really has allowed us to tap into technology that we may not otherwise have thought of using. I do think that coming back to use of natural history studies, so absolutely big fan of it. I'm obviously biased and prejudiced having been the PI of a large-scale natural history study for many years. What I think we really need is to have patients be part of this process way back at the beginning of the development process. So as you probably know, the FDA actually holds public meetings when the drugs are being considered for approval. So these are when the companies are presenting their clinical trial data, when they are hoping to seek approval for their drugs in process. And they have public meetings to decide, and patients can have a voice and help perhaps sway the committees to approve this drug. Now, what I would say is that engagement with patients need to start much, much earlier. Not right at the end when the drugs are up for consideration of approval, but before the clinical trial has even been launched. And I think what we really need is legislation to force the FDA to actually engage with patients, right? So before you can approve an IND, you need to have input from the patient community and from the clinicians who take care of these patients, from the key opinion leaders, to say, is this feasible? Is this likely to be a good outcome? Is there, for example, a need to use placebo? Is this a kind of placebo that is most appropriate for this population? Right? So there are a lot of questions that only the patients who are living the disease, who are in the trenches, and the clinicians who are dealing with these patients every day can really help the FDA answer.
That's terrific. Dr. Skinner, you are living this life, and you have been in the rare disease space for a long time. And I will tell the audience, it's a fascinating world. I've met real heroes in my research. We have a person with lived experience who is joining our program shortly. We have later in our program Kelly Maynard, who's founder of the Little Hercules Foundation, who's actually part of the state of Ohio Rare Disease Advisory Council. So structurally, I think one of my beefs with this is why don't we know a lot more about it? Why don't we discuss this a lot more? Why are we waiting for World Rare Disease Day to do this, honestly? And so I guess my question to you on the FDA side, and maybe other reforms you think are important, is that I know that some in the rare disease community are hoping the FDA begins to build in advisory councils of experts so that at various stages in the process, both in terms of, as the drugs are being communicated, but there are rare disease advisory councils that are built in, that there are patient-oriented discussions that are built in. So it's less ad hoc, less when one wants to, and more a part of the playbook, if you will. I was surprised by Dr. Woodcock's openness to some of this, and would love to get your sense of specifically what would be some of the elements of FDA reform or social and structural research reform that you think are important that we know about.
I think that's a great lead in, and there is experience for this. I mean, the concepts of health equity really mean that we all need to be included, and we need to be mindful of the diversity of the patient populations and those that have been underserved. Within the blood world where I come from, largely arising out of the HIV crisis of the 80s, several federal advisory committees were created that included patients at the FDA and at HHS. I've had a privilege to serve on many of them for many years. And those have been really highly effective in ensuring that the patient voice is there, that patients are sitting down with the regulators, the decision makers, but they don't really speak to clinical trial design. So I would love to see more early on. I think it can come from the FDA, can also come from industry. I've had the privilege to serve on data safety monitoring boards, to participate in clinical trial development programs where you actually ask the patients, what's the burden of this trial? I think we have a lot of experience as patients coming out of COVID, what can be done remotely and what can be done in person. And we will be very insightful that actually will help the clinical development process. The burdens of going into the lab to fill out just patient-reported outcome forms, when those can be done electronically, or monitoring visits, or doing local lab draws, whatever the nature of it may be, patients can help the efficiency of clinical trial development. Patients can make sure that the outcomes are right. And if the FDA has an open process that companies can come to, I think it really will complete that winning coalition. Clearly, Dr. Tan and I are aligned as patients and clinicians, and that certainly is the work that many organizations like NORD, which I have the privilege to serve on the board of as well, are focused on. But having the FDA as one of our key partners and industry, and all of us rowing together and understanding the importance of early engagement, I think is the key. And if it takes the regulatory or legislative tools to make that happen, I would be fully supportive.
Well, listen, I want to thank you. I've been thinking to myself about today's program, not just because of World Rare Diseases Day, but in 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, when people come back, they Google, they say, oh, I'd like to learn something, experiencing something that I don't know much about. Will these kind of discussions help? I think they will. I think people will hear you both. Dr. Wen-Hann Tan, attending physician, Division of Genetics and Genomics at Boston Children's Hospital and Associate Professor of Pediatrics at Harvard Medical School. Mark Skinner, President and CEO of the Institute for Policy Studies, an assistant professor as well at McMaster University, and as he said, an individual living the life of rare disease. Thank you both so much for joining us today. Really grateful.